Alright, so quickly how Thundering works right now. 4 debuffs go out, 3 of them are always on the DPS, and then the 4th is randomly either the healer or the tank. Of the 4 debuffs, 2 are positive, 2 are negative. While they persist, those affected get a 15% increase to damage done and healing done, and I believe they last 15 seconds. If the debuffs expire, they stun you for 8 seconds and basically kill you, do a bunch of damage over a few seconds, and that damage scales with the level of the key. And the way you clear them to stop that from happening is you have to match up with someone who has the opposite debuff of you. So if you have positive, you have to run on top of someone who's negative. At the moment, the AoE for this is really quite small. You pretty much have to run on your character model on top of the other person's character model to clear them. Now, I guess I'll start with the positives. It is much better than the first iteration. It's quite easy to understand and it visually makes sense. I like the fact that the debuffs have the very simple plus and minus icons on player frames. I also find the spell effects above the player heads to be quite easy to find, and I like the fact that the sky turns dark right before all the AoE swirlies come out onto the ground. I also like the fact that those swirlies aren't particularly dangerous, and the fundamental mechanic of a kind of dance or mechanic that people can play around for a damage buff or a healing buff. I don't mind that style of affix. I think the major problem I have with it at the moment is that it doesn't provide enough positives to outweigh the negatives. And that's mainly because I don't think a pseudo-random low uptime 15% damage buff warrants the headache of dealing with affix. Now obviously at the moment it doesn't work in combat, but obviously it should only work in combat, at least in my opinion. And I also think it is the punishment for failing the mechanic is excessively punishing. An 8-second stun that also deals your entire health point damage or more than that because it scales with the difficulty of the key. It's just, I mean, it's just guaranteed death if you fail the mechanic. And if one person fails the mechanic, it generally means that 2 people fail the mechanic. So 2 people wiping is pretty much a wipe. So there's a very high cost of failure, but not a very big reward for getting it right. Now this is one of the things I would like to see tuned in the future. If the damage buff was more like 30%, something like Bloodlust equivalent of damage bonus, I could see it being quite good and quite fun to play around. I would also actually like to see it mechanically changed in, I guess, a small way that could have a big impact. I would like to see the debuffs go out in the same way with the same 15-second timer, but then when the players are ready, they can drop the debuffs, and dropping the debuff gives the players the damage buff. So kind of like the affix would go out, the buffs would go out, the group could see who, if the healer gets it or the tank could get it. They could talk about what cooldowns they have up, if they should do a bigger pull, or if they should adjust their gameplay knowing that they have a substantial damage buff kind of banked if they play well. I feel like that could be really fun. Now, at the moment there's a few other issues. It is possible for one debuff to clear 2 of the opposite debuffs. It doesn't happen very often, but it is possible, and that basically just means that the 4th person dies. Guaranteed death. I imagine that's just a buff that will get fixed. You could also stack as the mechanic goes out, and you can basically remove the debuffs in the same instant that they go out. So if your group just stacks up when the Thundering Affix activates, you can entirely ignore the mechanic. I don't mind this actually, because there are certainly some boss fights and some situations where you just don't have the luxury of adjusting your positioning or stacking on other targets or something like that. So if you know it's coming and you know it's a bad time to have to worry about those kinds of things, if you really wanted to, you could preemptively stack or at least clear it right away as they come out, and not have to worry about failing the mechanic later on. At the moment, the internal cooldown looks like 1 minute with a random timer. Looks like anywhere from about 15 to 30 seconds. And it makes it difficult to play around. It makes it difficult to plan out exactly when the buffs are going to go out, or if damage is going to be available for a bigger pull or something like that. The RNG nature of it makes it hard to capitalize on. Now, I know a lot of people are saying it feels excessively punishing for melee, but I would say it actually feels punishing for pretty much everybody. Melee definitely can be punishing because melee real estate in some dungeons on some bosses with some group compositions can be at a premium or a difficult thing to play around. But even if you get it as ranged or your whole group is ranged, you're going to spend a lot of time wasted just running around. The other random aspect of it that I don't like is at the moment 4 debuffs go out. 3 of them are always on the 3 DPS, and then the 4th is a 50-50 chance of going on the tank or the healer. At the moment, I think this is pretty bad, but I also don't see how they could really fix that or change that. And the reason I say bad is because it's very random. If the tank gets it, they can do a significant amount of damage. It's also a buff to damage and healing, which helps quite a few tanks a lot for self-healing. But if a healer gets it, chances are they're not going to do anywhere near the kind of damage or be able to capitalize on the amount of damage that a tank could be doing. So if you really care about the damage aspect or the payoff of the affix, getting it on a healer just feels bad. But at the same time, getting the buff or the debuff on the tank and then having to have someone go and stand on the tank in a lot of situations is just a death sentence. There's a lot of like frontal cleaves or AoE damage and fire on the ground and stuff. Tanks aren't always the safest people to be standing on top of, and tank mobility is also oftentimes a trade-off you don't want to make. If your tank uses their mobility on getting to a target to drop a debuff, that might be the mobility that they don't have for other things that they would have needed it for. From this weekend alone, I've seen quite a few people run onto the tank to drop a debuff and get cleaved by the piercing shards from the big golem dudes in the Azure Vault. That's funny because that is a guaranteed death. That is a one-shot ability right there. At the moment, I guess you could sum the whole affix up as being quite boring. A low uptime, small damage buff that doesn't really do much with a chance of impossible situations and extremely punishing failure and extremely punishing for failure. But like I said, if there are a few small changes, like a larger damage buff or take away some of the RNG aspects of it, I could honestly see it being quite fun, especially or particularly for me, if it was strong enough for groups to be able to play around that buff specifically, change the routes that they're going to pull or pull bigger or things like that. The other small issue at the moment is that it does nothing to help healers with mana. Now for the last couple of years we've had affixes or seasonal affixes in Mythic Plus that have specifically helped or band-aided over the imbalance issue among healers with their mana. And some healers in Shadowlands, for example, really didn't need the extra mana, and other ones, that mana was the make or break for their spec being viable in Mythic Plus. And with this affix not helping healers' mana bars at all, either it's going to have to be added in some way, or Blizzard are going to have to sit down and actually balance healer mana, at least in Mythic Plus. The big outlier at the moment feels like Mistweaver, but not Fistweaver. Priest's mana actually feels quite good with the 2-point talent on the class tree that gives them mana back when their Shadow Word Pain expires. But still, Blizzard is still going to have to do something. But other than that, like I said, it's much better than it was with the first iteration. If the third iteration is a similar or even half as good again, I could see Thundering being really quite good. But that's it for now. So thanks for watching and algorithm stuff.